Today's scripture verse is from Luke chapter 7, verse 36 through 50. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in the town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little." Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for being here, and thank you for those of you who shared a little bit about the community. And just to reiterate what Joel said, to those of you who have continued to meet, to host, you have been the lifeblood of the church over the last couple of years as we've sought to navigate this unique time of trying to stay in community. And I would just encourage you, as this sermon is about to, for those of you who may be here and are not connected or not plugged in, today's one of those days for you to do that. Please find somebody, and you can sign up right today in one of the groups that are available to you. And also to Shirley and the youth, thank you for helping us out. For those of you who may know or have children in that age group but don't know, that on Friday evenings there's 50 to 60 youth that meet here. It's loud, it's crazy, it's fun, there's a lot of pizza, and so we'd love you to send any children you know that fit that age group, but also if you want to volunteer and be part of the community that way, it's a great way to build into the future of New York and the future of the church. All right, so we're continuing our journey as we started back in September through trying to put some definition around this new vision that we introduced about as we seek to be a church that is living out this sacred call of Jesus to love our neighbors and heal our city, and asking the question, what does that actually look like? And we have these core values that help understand what that is. And today we come to the value welcoming into community. Is it up there? I think we're trying this new thing, I don't know. But let me just read it for you. Welcoming into community, and that is that we seek to be a hospitable home in a transient city where everyone can be seen, known, and loved in genuine community. That's a core value. That's part of what it means to follow Jesus, to be a hospitable home in a transient city where everyone can be seen, known, and loved in genuine community. Now, you don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a religious person to want that, to find some deep resonance with that definition. I've only been to Disney World once, but if you've ever been there, you know that they capture the essence of this, because every time you show up, someone's either saying or there's a sign that says what? Welcome home. Welcome home. It's a deep longing inside of us, but knowing that you long for it, but having that need met, having a sense that you want to be seen and loved, but actually knowing why you have, those are very different things. And the premise of the sermon this morning is you won't understand why that sign resonates with you. You won't understand the sense of loneliness and aloneness that accompanies your life unless we can together answer the question that is found at the end of this reading in verse 49. Who is this Jesus? Only if you can answer that question will you not only understand why you have this deep need for a home, but why you can leave here, as that woman left that meal, in peace, knowing that you will never be alone because of who Jesus is and what he's done. So that's the premise this morning. And that is certainly something we have felt more acutely as individuals and as a society during the pandemic, this need for community and this deep sense of isolation and aloneness. But also missionally, as a church family, to try to think about it in light of who we are, because we increasingly live in a culture where people, particularly younger people, thinking about the youth, who they may pass a church and the doors may be open, but they often find the hearts and the minds and the arms of the people inside are closed. And so how does this story of hospitality help us bridge the gap with one another and with our neighbors as we seek to be this kind of a home? So we're going to look at it through the lens of the three characters in this story, the three who are in this meal. There's the woman who is unseen, and that's the need we share. There's the Pharisee who is unmoved, and that's the challenge that we face. You see that in verse 39. And then there's the guest who is undaunted, and we see the offer that he makes in verse 49. So the woman who's unseen, the Pharisee who's unmoved, and the guest who is undaunted. So first, this need we share in this woman. Now, when we're told that Jesus is reclining at the meal, there's a whole history of this I won't get into, but this is some kind of a special banquet. It's either happening on the Sabbath because Jesus was a guest at the temple, or they just want to get to know Jesus. Simon clearly wants to get to know Jesus. The woman clearly wants to get to know Jesus. And it's just a reminder, as not just an ancient, but if you know in your own life, that if you want to turn a stranger into a friend, if you want to break down barriers, what do? You invite somebody over for a meal. There's a power in sitting around a table. And in the ancient Near East in particular, there was a sense in which the doors were always left open of your home. So the reason this woman is here isn't because she was necessarily invited. It was because there was no Airbnb, there was no Grubhub. There was a sense in which, as Aristotle said, one of the chief virtues of any great civilization is hospitality, because they were completely interdependent on each other. So this man's house, his doors were always open. And people could just come in and participate in the meal, and maybe stand along the sides of the wall, but they could listen in and hear. And if you read the Bible from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you see the centrality of meals in which the grace and the power of God is constantly being shown in the midst of the table. And so we don't know what Simon's motives were in inviting Jesus. He was probably skeptical. Maybe he was he was trying to see if he was one of them. But regardless of his motives, the fact that he opened his home, guess who showed up? God. And in the midst of that meal, the mission and the love and the power of this new kingdom was made manifest, and lives were changed. It's why the writer of Hebrews puts it this way: for by hospitality some have received angels without knowing it. By hospitality some have received angels without knowing it. Simon didn't know that he had received God. And so one commentator puts it this way: for Christians, there's an expectation that God will play a significant role in the ordinary exchange between guests and hosts. And this lends to hospitality a sacramental quality. Now, what does that mean? It just means something common can become holy, become a means of grace, like baptism, like the Lord's Supper. And that when you invite someone for coffee, and you invite somebody over for a meal, or you get together with them, something can happen There's a sacramental quality in the aspect of hospitality that you find in the Bible. And that's the dynamics that are on display here, this radical, subversive kingdom just around this table. So let's go into the room with them and look at these three characters and see what happens. Because they're starting with this woman, right? We see she's immediately labeled as what? A sinner. And again, if you understand the Greek, which I don't, but people who do wrote about it, so I read about it, she was probably a prostitute. She was someone who was tagged and labeled, and so she was seen as this word implies, she was condemned as an outsider. She was seen as unworthy and as unclean. There was no way she was ever going to be asked, pull up a chair and have a seat at this table. At best, she could show up and stand on the sides. And again, as I was sitting with these three characters, if we put ourselves in her sandals, even though our lives may be very different than hers, we can certainly connect with the pain of isolation and loneliness and being unseen like this woman was. I don't know about you, but has this ever happened to you? She was in a room full of people. She was from the same town as these people, so they all knew her. They knew her name. And yet she felt utterly alone. You can live in New York City and be surrounded by thousands and thousands of people and feel completely alone and completely unseen. I remember back when my dad passed away a long time ago, over 30 years ago, and I was a student at Columbia. And after the funeral, I had to come back in because the exams were kicking in, and I remember riding the one train on the way up on 116th Street, and it was packed, and I had never felt so alone and so isolated and so unseen. I had all this pain, and no one knew it. That's this woman. That's what it means to be human. She was a neighbor, but she was completely estranged from her neighbors. And that's why this question in verse 44 of Jesus, do you see this woman, is so powerful, right? Because the answer is no. No one saw her. They saw her, but they didn't see her. Do you see this woman, he's saying to her? And we've felt this in some ways, as I said, in the pandemic. We've felt the pain of isolation. If you remember back in March and April when the economists were all writing about the potential for economic recession, what were the psychologists and the physicians warning about? Social recession, societal recession. There was an article I read just this week in Harvard Magazine from back in January to talk about 3 different aspects of loneliness that are endemic to people's experience, but particularly came out during the pandemic. There's interpersonal loneliness, which asks the questions, do I have someone in my life that I can tell my troubles to? There's existential loneliness. Do I fit into the universe? Do I have a sense that my life has any meaning or purpose? And in this article, the tragedy of it is that the most lonely people in our society today are the people who are the most connected, 18 to 24-year-olds. They have more friends than I ever had when I was 19, but they are more deeply lonely and deeply lost and deeply isolated than any other group walking around. And the last one is societal loneliness. If I enter a room, is my arrival both anticipated and welcomed? It's a great question to ask for a church, right? Certainly for this woman, the answer was no. When I enter a room, is my arrival both anticipated and welcome? That is, do we have these red velvet ropes that we put around? They're not my type. They don't look like me. They don't act like me. They don't sound like me. I was listening to an interview with a guy named Will Willimon, who's a professor down at Duke, and he's a pastor, and he writes beautifully about the church and pastoring, and he was talking about this church in Raleigh-Durham where he attended, and there was a woman who was being baptized, being brought into the community, right? The symbol of you're going to now be part of our family, and she didn't speak English, and so before she was baptized, she was asked by the pastor, so why this church? Why this community? And she said, for me and my son, this was the first church that welcomed us in. It was the first place we felt like we were part of the family. See the power of being seen, the power of being recognized, the power of being invited in. This is what this woman experiences, and this is what we all walk around with in one degree or the other. And Sylvia Plath, who was a confessional poet, evidently, that's a thing, After she died, they found her diaries, and this is one of the things she wrote, and it's always stuck with me. Life is loneliness. Despite all the grins and smiles that we exchange, despite all the opiates we take, when at last you find someone to whom you feel you can pour out your soul, you stop in shock at the words you utter, because they're so rusty and so ugly and so meaningless and feeble from being kept in the small, cramped, dark inside of you for so long. That is a powerful indictment and an explanation of the human condition, right? How are you? I'm fine. We have all these different relationships, all these different connections, but to actually have somebody to whom we can actually share what's really going on, it feels rusty and cramped. And so you feel the weight of Jesus' question again. Do you see this woman? The importance of being seen and loved and received. This is why community groups and West Side women and West Side men and all those things are so important to us. It isn't enough just to show up on Sundays, either in person or online. And one of the reasons that we stop and do what we just did, right? We greet. What is going on when we say stop for a minute and reach out and say hello to that person? It's an act of hospitality. It's a way of saying in the context of worship that there was a time in which I was unseen and unloved, but God found me. He sought me out. I was a stranger, and he brought me into his family. And I don't want to be worshiping around strangers. It's a way of saying, right, I see you, and you matter, not just to God, but to me, because we are a family. It isn't just a break in the action. It is part of that cosmic hospitality that breaks into our lives and say, you're seen, and you matter, and you're part of a family. And so, in this woman who is unseen, who never utters a word, who never speaks, throughout this whole story, right, we see this need that we share. It is not good to be alone. So that's the woman. But secondly, we see the Pharisee, right, who is unmoved, and that's the challenge that we face. And here we begin to see that kind of subversive, revolutionary thing that Jesus came to bring when he says, the kingdom of God is near. He's going to break down the kind of social conventions that had kept people apart. And what we see in the light of this story, right, is the person who is the host, Simon, who has the resources, both spiritually and socially and economically, to break down the barriers. He's actually the one who's the obstacle. It's not the sinner, it's the saint. It's not the outsider who's the problem, it's the insider. It's Simon who is the one who is in the way. And so Jesus has come to kind of deconstruct all of those social conventions that keep us apart. And so despite the fact that he has all these resources, he's unmoved in the face of the woman's problem. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpacking why that is. We'll talk a little bit about it, but more I want to just sit with and put ourselves in his sandal and say, what is it about my life personally? And how can we as a church think about how we might be obstacles to people feeling seen and loved in our homes, in our workplaces, and here at West 83rd? Because Simon, as the person who is the insider, who has the religious and spiritual resources, sets himself apart from Jesus and from the woman. That on the outside, he looks warm and hospitable. His doors are open. There's food on the table. There's probably all this kind of activity going on. But what's actually going on the inside? See verse 39, he has a heart murmur. He says to himself, that's where you really know who he is and how he feels about the people. And then the heart murmur is one of condescending judgment that leads to the kind of personal and existential and societal loneliness. Right? He's polite on the outside, but he's already made up his mind about whether or not this woman or this rabbi is going to be part of his club. I remember when I was in college, I sang in the concert choir, and you got assigned people to sit next to you. And the person who was going to be sitting next to me, and I'll apologize to him now if he's ever listens, Dan. He was this tall, goofy-looking guy with his crazy hair, and I didn't know him. I never talked to him, but he was going to sit next to me, and I'd already made up my mind. This is going to be terrible. Right? That was me. That was the murmur of my heart. On the outside, I was polite. I was kind. But I'd already made up my mind, because of what he looked like and the way he acted, that he didn't quite fit the standards that I brought. Like being in concert choir is any cool thing, right? It is, but you know. But we do that all the time. The murmur of my heart, I had made up my mind. He turned out to be one of my best friends by the grace of God and his own hospitality. But how often do we do that, right? And you can hear this in the murmur of Simon's heart in verse 39. If Jesus were really one of us, there's no way he would be so warm to this woman. If he was really one of us, there's no way he would understand and let this woman touch him. See, this is the social convention that operates so often in our lives that Jesus came to completely deconstruct. Because what is going on here? Jesus will be embraced only if he excludes. Jesus will be welcomed only if he unwelcomes this woman. And what is that, right? Ever been on Twitter? That's just tribalism. I have my tribe, you have your tribe. You're either for us or against us. It's in our politics. It's everywhere. It's inside the church, right? Because what is going on here? See how God's law can be weaponized against people to make them feel excluded? That we can label somebody and exclude them before we even know their name or let them say a word. But we've decided they're a sinner and they're not worthy of our presence. And the tragic irony of the story is that the very person whose identity is, I was an alien and a stranger, Simon, is the one who's doing the excluding. Because the reason you were in the tribe in the first place, right, of Israel, is because of what? The hospitality of God, who saw you as a stranger and welcomed you in. And in the book of Exodus, that tribe is told what? You are not to oppress a stranger, because they knew the heart of a stranger, because they were strangers in Egypt. Hear that? You are not to oppress a stranger. You are not to exclude them, because you know what? The heart of a stranger. Not just the social conventions of a stranger. Your heart murmur and their heart murmur is the same. You know what it's like to be on the outside. You know what it's like to be unseen. You know what it's like to be left for dead. And therefore, when you see somebody who's in that state, your heart is supposed to resonate with their heart, and you just welcome them in. That's the identity of this person. Jonathan Sacks, who was a brilliant Jewish theologian, put it this way. In the Old Testament, there's one verse about loving your neighbor as yourself. There's 36 that say love the stranger. And he said that, he wrote this: the supreme religious challenge is to see God's image in one who is not in our image. Hear that? The supreme religious challenge is to see God's image in one who is not in our image. And Simon failed that challenge. He said, if Jesus really was one of us, he would see her for who she really is. And Jesus comes along and says, you see in her the image of God, and you welcome her in. That's what he's come to do. See, this is why biblical hospitality is so central to following the sacred call of Jesus to love our neighbors and heal our city. The word itself in Greek is the love of a stranger, philoxenia. And I only use that word because it's the opposite of xenophobia, which is the hatred or the fear of a stranger. And so biblical hospitality says you see that stranger, you love them like Philo, like a brother, like family. In other words, as one writer said, you treat everyone with the same dignity, respect, and compassion that you would treat your own family, because why? That's how God treats you. And that is what will break down the barriers. That is what not just turns strangers into friends, but strangers ultimately into family. And here is where the weight of this text began to really impress itself upon me. Because in what way am I like Simon? And in what way is the church, whether it's Redeemer Westside or the American church or the church in general, is like Simon's house, in which our doors are open but our hearts aren't? And at least for me, I am very much often like the Pharisee. I can be polite but aloof. I can be present but not particularly warm. I can see people but not really see them. And oftentimes, it's because of my exposure to the moral framework of the Bible. That's the great tragedy, right? Because now I have these moral categories that can make me feel superior, and now I have God's imprimatur on, oh yeah, somebody's in and somebody's out. And I can take that into my heart and quickly label people, and that overrides this idea of loving the stranger before they've ever said a word or before I know their name. I know exactly who they are because the Bible tells me so. And I've excluded them. And corporately as the church, what is the challenge going forward? Because let's face it, the church is in a season of reckoning at the moment. A friend of mine earlier this week sent me an article. You may have seen it in the Wall Street Journal. There was this survey of people from the ages of 13 to 25. And it was done in part with Princeton Theological Seminary right down the road. And what they found is half of the individuals who were surveyed in the age group of 13 to 25 see the church as completely irrelevant and unwelcoming to their lives. These are religious people, by the way, because they don't care about the issues that matter deeply to them. There was one respondent who was 22 years old, a church attender, and he talks about how he was reluctant to wear a cross around his neck because even though he feels a strong connection to Jesus, he's afraid people will associate that cross with judgment. And this is what he said. The fact that the Christian faith has become a symbol of judgment speaks to that gap between religious organizations and the non-judgment that we value as young people. See, it's really important that our young people are part of our church. It's really important that they're seen and heard. It's really important that we listen to them, not just have them pass out bulletins, because they have something to tell us. Now, look, it's really easy to blame the church and say, oh, the church is out of step, but the church is always out of step. The church has historically been a countercultural thing. But I think we have to look in the mirror and say, in light of this reckoning about the church, what is happening where so many people inside and outside the church, particularly younger people, are not showing up? And they've decided the church isn't relevant to their lives. Part of it's the hypocrisy. Part of it is this heart murmur of quiet condescension towards people whose names we don't know and whose voices we don't listen to. And they see it. And this particular article talked about, it was under issues of gender and sexual identity, race, income equality, and immigration. Younger people increasingly feel a stiff arm from the church in those areas. Now, the answer is not to compromise the ethics of the Bible. It's not to compromise the Word of God, because the Word of God and the ethics of the Bible are an extension of God's love for us. They are a roadmap to human flourishing. But at least in my own heart, it's doing the hard work of recapturing a vocabulary and a posture of welcome modeled by Jesus. Because he is holy. He is God himself. And he was constantly being criticized. Why? Because he was eating with sinners and tax collectors. And that group of people in the New Testament is considered, you think about the worst kind of person in your mind who should be excluded, that's them. And Jesus was constantly eating with them, because he was modeling a way in which you could love and embrace people with whom you differ, because that was the way to get them into the family of God. Miroslav Volf put it this way: at the core of the Christian faith lies the persuasion that others need not to be perceived as innocent in order to be loved. Hear that? But ought to be embraced even when they are perceived as wrongdoers. Go read John 4 and Jesus sitting in a well talking to a woman who is sexually promiscuous, or to a man on a cross who must have done something unspeakable because he was being executed by the Roman government, or to the Roman centurion. The way the early church grew in the first 200 years, 80% of the converts was through hospitality. There was no church to come to. There was no YouTube. There were no podcasts. There were just you and your open doors and getting to know people who thought you were crazy. And it was their love of the stranger, modeling Jesus, through which the church exploded. And so the guest, the woman is unseen. The host, the Pharisee, is unmoved. So how do we break this logjam? That's the guest who is undaunted. and the offer that he makes in verse 49 of forgiveness. Jesus has come into this world. He is undaunted. What do I mean by that? He will not play the game. He will not play by the normal societal games in which if you want power, if you want to be on the inside, you have to do it our way. And it all started after his baptism, right? When he met Satan in the wilderness, what was that? That was the beginning of the test for him. Because it was a way of saying, you don't have to live as an outsider. You don't have to live as someone who is excluded. Do these things, and you can show how great you are. And his whole life and ministry, he knew that everything he did was going to cost him physically, socially, and emotionally. And yet he kept showing up over and over and over again, knowing he was going to be rejected, undaunted in the face of that rejection, so that this morning, when you and I leave here, we can leave here in peace, forgiven, knowing that we will never, ever be alone. And it's because of Jesus' persistence in pursuing people like us that is true. And of all the verses that probably I sat with the most over the last 2 weeks in this text, it's verse 36, in which he was invited in, and Jesus said, sure, I'll be there. And it struck me as that was such an act of grace, because Jesus didn't have to go. And he knew that when he went, he was going to be judged, and he was going to be ultimately condemned, but he kept showing up, and that is an extension. That's just a small little window into what we're about to celebrate. Yes, in about a month in Advent, Christmas is coming, is the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Every act, every meal, every conversation, sitting at the well was just an extension of the incarnation in which Jesus showed up and left the comfort of his heavenly home and was born in a stable, and lived the first, I don't know how many early years of his life as a political refugee in Egypt, and described his life as never having a place to put his head down. He was essentially Israel embodied, an alien and a stranger his whole life. And he did this because he knew, as you can go to another meal, if you want to read the book of Luke, Joel was pointing this out to me, the whole book of Luke, it seems like he's either going to, eating at, or coming from a meal. And there's another passage in Luke 14 where there's this idea of this great banquet, this ultimate feast. I was in the park last week walking Charlie, our dog, and there was this picnic table right up there on the northern end of the great lawn, and there was like 7 or 8 women sitting around, and they had flowers on either end, and they were just laughing and having the greatest time. Like, that's just a window into what we want, right? And Luke 14 says there's a great banquet coming. And Jesus showed up undaunted because he wants everybody there. And he will make a way so that we can be there. And how did he do it? He went to the very core of why we feel estranged and unseen in the first place, and that is our sin. Our sin. Elizabeth Elliot, who knew a lot about loneliness and suffering, wrote a book called Loneliness, and in there she has this quote by this theologian named Paul Tillich. And this is what he writes. Oh, there you go. Being alive means being in a body, right? That's being human. A body separated from all other bodies. And being separated means being alone, right? That's just what it means to be human. You're all individual bodies. This is true of every creature, and it is more true of mankind than of any other. This is it, though. He is not only alone, he knows that he's alone. And this aloneness he cannot endure. Neither can he escape it. It is his destiny to be alone and to be aware of it. That is a brilliant insight into the human condition of why we so long to hear the words, welcome home. And Eliot goes on to point out in the book that the reason we go from just being alone and solitude, which are good things, by the way, to this awareness of loneliness is because we rejected God in Genesis 3. We turned our backs on his hospitality. We said, we don't want to live with you. We can live on our own, and we've been living east of Eden ever since. Restless wanderers, pilgrims in a world looking for a welcome home. And so Jesus came into the world, as Eliot points out, to invite us in John chapter 15. He says, I want to call you my friends. I want to make you part of my family. I want to bring you home. That's why he showed up. But somehow he had to reverse what happened in Genesis chapter 3. And it's forgiveness. If you've ever read Hannah Arendt and The Human Condition, she put it this way: the discovery of the role of forgiveness in the realm of human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth. The discovery of the role of forgiveness in the realm of human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth. What is she saying? It's his forgiveness, his gift to us on the cross, that actually made it possible now to embrace the outsider, to be seen and loved, and to create a meal that will never end. That's what this parable that Jesus tells Simon is about. It's a pretty frightening insight, by the way, because did you notice that Simon is thinking to himself, and he must think, now Jesus is reading my thoughts, right? He goes, let me tell you something, Simon. And Simon must have been shocked, because he must have thought, how does Jesus know? Jesus knows everything you think. He knows every murmur of your heart. And in this respect, it's like an answer to a prayer. He tells them this story about these two debts, one which would have been the equivalent of about 2 years' wages, and one which would have been the equivalent of about 2 months of wages. And he shows Simon what the difference is between a lavish kind of love, which is what the woman is showing, and a stingy kind of love, which is what Simon is showing. And this is the point of the parable, and I encourage you to go back and look at it this week. It's not the size of the debt that leads to a loving life, but the depth of our gratitude towards the one who has paid the debt. Hear that? The point of the parable, the good news of the gospel is that it's not the size of the debt that leads to a loving life, but the depth of our gratitude towards the one who has paid. It's gratitude that opens our arms and opens our hearts and opens our homes to let people in who are different than us. See, Simon had this murmur of disdain and judgment. Why? Because he had no gratitude in his heart. He didn't think he needed to be forgiven. He didn't see himself as someone who was in need, but he didn't understand the word, verse 42, neither. The key to understanding the gospel is it doesn't matter the size of the debt. Neither of them could have repaid it. And so we need someone to come along and pay the debt, regardless of whether you're a good moral person who goes to church like Simon or some kind of a pagan outsider. It doesn't matter. Jesus has to show up and pay the debt, and that's what he did. That's why he was born. That's why he lived, so that he could go to the cross and pay the ransom for you and for me. And the whole point is to the degree that you understand yourself as a sinner, knowing that you're undeserving, an alien and a stranger in this world, and that Jesus welcomed you home, to that degree it will fill you with gratitude and joy, and it will unleash in you a lavish hospitality to everybody. Because you won't see yourself as any different than anybody else. You will just be experiencing the hospitality of God. That's what Jesus is pointing out to Simon. He's saying, look at this woman. Look at what she did. She was more of a host than you ever were. She did all this stuff. It cost the alabaster jar, that was probably a year's wages. She didn't care that she was embarrassed. She didn't care about anything. She was just throwing her love and hospitality. And what does it mean to be human? It means to love. She was far more human than Simon was. And it was because she understood the depths of her sin and the forgiveness that was offered to her by God. You, on the other hand, Simon, Jesus is saying, you don't think you need grace, and it has made you cold and hard and unwelcoming because you don't have the assurance that you are loved. This woman knows she is loved. She knows she's forgiven. And that gives her an abundance of hospitality in her life. So that is the point of the parable. To the degree that you know what the cross means, and you understand the depths of your own sin and the price that Jesus paid, and it fills you with gratitude, your arms and your heart will be open to the stranger. There were three, I'll just close with this, and then we're going to look at some questions before we sing. But I remember reading this book by Philip Yancey once, and he said he was quoting a survey of the words Americans most like to hear. And there are these three things: I love you, I forgive you, and supper is ready. That's the church. You're loved, you're forgiven, pull up a chair. welcome home. Now, how does that happen? I think there's some questions. Over the next 20 seconds or so, the musicians can come back up if you want. What silent judgments exist in my heart towards specific individuals or groups? What can I do this week to cultivate gratitude for Jesus' love for me? Maybe go back and read Luke 15 in the prodigal. How can I draw the most people into a deep experience of God's hospitality by the use of my money, things, home, and church home? In other words, your hospitality has to be strategic, not spontaneous. That means maybe on a Sunday when you're here, you talk to the people that you know, but you also, every Sunday, you're seeking out one person that you don't know and you introduce yourself. Or if you're going out to brunch with friends, you find one person who doesn't have a place to go and you invite them with you. Or you open up your home. I don't know, think about what that means. Who do I know who is struggling with loneliness that I can reach out to this week? And what's one step I can take this week to move deeper into the community at Redeemer Westside? Maybe it means coming back to worship in person. Maybe it means joining a group. Maybe it means volunteering. But one of those things that you can do to move deeper into the community at Redeemer Westside. So let's take about 20 or 30 seconds. I'll pray and then go over those questions and then we'll sing. Father, help us to be a community that is welcoming to others. Work by your Spirit as we think about these questions now for the glory of Jesus Christ. Amen. Good morning.